In this global pandemic, the oil sector hopes the worst is over. This week, the world's major oil-producing countries reached a historic deal to cut a tenth of their collective oil production. The agreement brings to an end a months-long price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. But if the global economy remains shut down for weeks, maybe months, is the curtailment just a band-aid solution? Jason Kenney is the Premier of Alberta. He joins us now from Edmonton. Hi, Premier Kenney. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Vashi.
I'm going to, of course, get to the state of the spread of COVID-19 in your province, but I do want to start off getting your reaction to this deal, the deal to cut production. Are you confident that it's going to help the overall situation where the market is concerned? So far, on news of the deal, prices barely moved.
Yes, in fact, prices went down a bit after the initial deal was inked a couple of days ago. First of all, let me tell you that our government has participated in these discussions with OPEC+. Our Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, has been in discussions directly with the Secretary General of OPEC and participated as an observer, I think for the first time in Canadian history, that we had a minister at the table, although telephonically. And we registered our point, which is that the Saudis and Russians started the disastrous price war, and it was their responsibility to put out the fire that they started. Alberta has already been under curtailment of production for 15 months, and even if we wanted to, we couldn't affect global prices because of the lack of pipelines to the coasts. That means that we really can't have an impact. And even if we tried to surge production to make up for the curtailment in OPEC and Russia, it wouldn't make a difference because of the lack of pipeline access. Having said that, it at least is some small sign of hope for a devastated industry. However, with the huge crash in demand and consumption and the surge in supply coming from OPEC over the past month, global inventories for oil are at tank tops full. So most projections, Vashi, are that we will continue to experience extremely low prices for at least the next 18 months, and that will have a devastating impact on Alberta, and it will affect the entire Canadian economy.
So your estimates, what you're hearing is that the prices that we're seeing, these incredibly low oil prices, are here to stay for the next 18 months.
There will obviously be some variance, but at least this agreement prevents an even more catastrophic situation where you would have supply surging into nowhere to put it. That would have required even greater shut-ins of production here in Alberta and elsewhere, which could potentially have had a really damaging permanent effect on some of our reservoirs. So I don't want to be completely pessimistic about this. It is at least sanity has returned to global oil markets, but a lot of damage has been done, and we'll be experiencing that damage probably with extremely depressed prices for the next 18 months.
Let me ask you what this does to the ask from the federal government, because we've been following the ask and the reply from the Fed so far. They have promised some sort of help for the oil sector. My understanding is that there is going to be some kind of announcement this week. I also understand that it will mostly be targeted at cleanup for orphan wells as well as helping with liquidity. I know the latter you've asked specifically about. Is there anything beyond those two things that you want to see?
Well, those have been our main points with Ottawa quite frankly, we've been proposing now for the better part of 9 or 10 months a partnership with Ottawa to get good blue-collar folks back to work, remediating and completing wells, and that also helps to address an environmental liability. And it sounds we are hopeful that there will be an announcement from Ottawa on that in the days to come. We've already put hundreds of millions of dollars from our government into accelerated well reclamation. But fundamentally, if we want to ensure that the largest subsector of the Canadian economy, our energy industry, is here to fight another day, and we protect the 800,000 jobs that are connected to that industry directly or indirectly, then we do need some emergency liquidity measures through some kind of extraordinary credit backstop. And we've been working with the federal government on that for the past month. People in the industry here are getting increasingly concerned as the clock ticks, but I understand that the government of Canada has been managing, like we have, multiple crises simultaneously. We do hope that they land on a meaningful package to throw a lifeline to the largest subsector of the Canadian economy this week.
I want to switch gears and ask you about the spread of COVID-19 in your province, and specifically an announcement you made a few days ago to send surplus personal protective equipment to some other provinces. Obviously a move that was well received across the country. Are you concerned at all that if the sort of trajectory of the virus in your province changes or alters, that you won't have what you need?
No, I'm not concerned. And we would not have made this decision to share a large amount of medical equipment with other provinces if we had any credible concern that it would catch us short. The truth is that even on the elevated scenario of our modeling that I released last week, we would have a significant surplus of equipment like N95 masks, ventilators, etc. And we are nowhere near hitting that elevated peak. Of course, we're going to be vigilant, but where we're at today is that we are, in terms of hospitalizations and ICU admissions, which I think are the key metrics, we're at about 1/4 of where we modeled we would be under our probable scenario. And that is credit to Albertans responding positively to the public health orders, to social and physical distancing, and it's also credit, Vashi, to the fact that Alberta has been leading the world in testing, and we had a very aggressive and widespread tracing program as soon as we saw the first infection here. So I think we've done a very good job of tracking and containing the spread. We now have fewer than 50 people in hospital, I think the latest number is 13 in ICU. As I said on Saturday, Vashi, I could not in conscience, as a Canadian, sit here with a huge and growing stockpile of critical equipment when some other provinces are within days of exhausting their supplies. We've also had great success, and I give credit to Alberta Health Services, Procurement Division. When they heard rumors about a pandemic in China in late November, early December, they started surging orders, and we got ahead of the queue of virtually every jurisdiction. So even just last night, we had another cargo jet arrive from China filled with equipment. So we are confident that we'll be able to provide for our frontline workers here in Alberta, maintain a surplus of equipment as a margin for error, and still share a lot of equipment with BC, Quebec, and Ontario.
A lot of what will be required when the conversation turns to loosening restrictions or relaxing restrictions is an increased capacity in testing. And you tweeted yesterday that you're directing health officials to use or to consider using testing methods that are approved by regulators in other countries, not specifically by Health Canada. Does that mean that you don't trust Health Canada?
No, of course I trust them as their credibility as a agency in terms of their approvals, but we're not going to wait for Health Canada to play catch up with, for example, the European Union's drug regulator or the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. The direction I've given our officials is that if we see a highly credible regulator of medications in a peer jurisdiction like the European Union, Australia, or the United States that has approved a test or a vaccine or medication, we should pursue that. We should not wait for Health Canada to catch up. So we're not going to allow, I think one of the critical learnings about a response to pandemic is you do not allow bureaucracy to get in the way of speed of response. And that's one of the reasons that Alberta is participating, for example, in trials for hydroxychloroquine, which is a potential medical treatment.
But with respect, Premier, it's not exactly just about bureaucracy, right? Health Canada performs a function in which they vet these tests. And Dr. Tam today, in response to your tweet, said that they do have significant concerns about the quality of some of those tests. So if you instead defer to speed and you end up with tests that aren't accurate, that becomes a health risk in and of itself, does it not?
Is Dr. Tam suggesting that the European Union's regulator of medications or the Food and Drug Administration approve things that are dangerous for public use? This is the same Dr. Tam who is telling us that we shouldn't close our borders to countries with high levels of infection, and who in January was repeating talking points out of the PRC about the no evidence of human-to-human transmission. So we'll look at all of the body of evidence that's out there when it comes to these things, and if we see a credible regulator of a pure jurisdiction, like, for example, the European Union, that has approved a test vaccine or medication for use, then I think we should be prepared to consider that for use here in Canada. We're not going to be feel constrained under our Public Health Act, waiting for Ottawa to do what other highly sophisticated jurisdictions.
I just want to be clear, though, Premier, because those are pretty specific comments that you've made about Dr. Tam. Do you feel that she isn't qualified to be doing her job? I mean, when you refer, for example, to the recommendation around human-to-human transmission, that is what the science was saying at the time. Were your public health officials telling you something different?
Of course, she's qualified. But I also think it's, of course, absolutely evident that we were wrong not to follow the lead of jurisdictions like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and others who closed their borders from countries with a high rate of infection months earlier than Canada did.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Premier. Appreciate your time this evening. I'm out of time.
My pleasure.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. The federal government could announce details this week of a promised aid package for that sector after the global economy ground to a halt in response to COVID-19. Canadian oil prices went into a tailspin. A barrel of Alberta oil now sits at around $5. In March, the Fed said help was, quote, days away, hours away, the finance minister said at one point for the industry, but it's now mid-April. This weekend, major oil-producing countries reached a historic deal to cut production to help lift prices. But does Alberta still need significant support from Ottawa? Paula Simons is an independent senator from that province. She joins us from Edmonton. Hi, Senator Simons. Good to see you.
Good to see. Well, I can't see you, but I'm sure it would be lovely if I could.
Senator, I mentioned there sort of the tailspin we've seen with oil prices. It's been due to decreased demand, but also to a price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia. We saw a bit of that get resolved in that the price war is, I guess, officially over, but the prices haven't rebounded. They're still extremely low. When you talk about help for the oil sector as it pertains to Alberta, what would you like to see from the federal government?
You know, it's really interesting because, as you said, on March 25th, when Minister Morneau was in front of the Senate, he said there would be some kind of assistance within hours or days. So I was a little taken aback when the minister was back before the Senate on Saturday, and I was watching the live stream from Edmonton. And when he was asked about this, he said that there would be no specific assistance for the oil industry. He said that the assistance would be sector agnostic, which is not, I think, what people in Alberta had been led to believe or led to expect. There are still some significant challenges for producers here, especially for the junior oil producers who are doing conventional oil. The big, heavy oil players are a little bit more stable. But, you know, I think there isn't an expectation of a straight up bailout. I think everybody knows that that's politically unpalatable and economically not very viable. But I think people are still hopeful that maybe there will be some kind of support that allows more liquidity, that allows people to borrow, whether that's some kind of backstop or guarantee for borrowers. I think people have been very hopeful. Premier Kenney started talking about the idea of some kind of support for oilfield service workers to be doing cleanup of abandoned and orphaned wells, which would get people back to work and clean up an environmental hazard. So people are, I think, still hoping that there will be some kind of creative solution, although I don't think they're really expecting Ottawa to come riding to the rescue, like at the end of a movie.
If in fact the federal government does address the liquidity issue, does provide funds for the cleanup of orphan wells, but parcels it in a package that also addresses some of the other sectoral vulnerabilities, like in airlines and tourism. Those are the two the Prime Minister keeps mentioning in concert with the oil sector every time he's asked about this aid package. If they do address those two pillars, even though it's together with other stuff, is that okay?
Well, it would be okay for me. I am not an oil company. I mean, I think that's a reasonably pragmatic solution. And certainly the 75% wage backstop will help all kinds of companies, including oil and gas companies. But as you mentioned off the top, the problems in the industry aren't just about COVID-19 and the reduced demand. They're also about systemic problems with world oil prices. Right now, the Russians and the Saudis have come to a kind of a stalemate, having played chicken for the last month. But, it's a reminder of just how vulnerable Canadian producers are to international forces that are completely outside our control. So, would I like to see some kind of program that leads us towards a more stabilized market while at the same time helping us transition gradually towards a lower carbon economy? Absolutely. What disturbed me is that when I started tweeting about this on Saturday, I saw an awful lot of schadenfreude from people across Canada who sort of seemed to think, well, Alberta's had it so good for so long, they can just take this on the chin. It sort of serves them right. And I would point out to people that, Alberta's energy sector doesn't just power Alberta's economy. It drives a lot of the federal economy and the federal exchequer at a time when we need money in the federal exchequer. So we don't want to cut off our noses to spite our faces. I would also say, although I represent Alberta, this is not just an Alberta problem. It's to an extent a Saskatchewan problem and to a huge degree a Newfoundland problem. Having Newfoundland default, having Newfoundland go into the effective, receivership is not good for Canada either. So we need to come up with solutions that are transnational, that help all of our key sectors, but to sort of jeer at the oil sector at a time when we're all need to be united as a country is really peculiarly unhelpful.
And we have had Premier Ball on the show quite frequently over the past month, who's made similar pleas to the federal government. My understanding is around the cabinet table, at least, or within the federal government, there is some pushback on the appearance of subsidizing oil companies to any degree. You'd be familiar, of course, with the political debate around this. It's not as hyper-political as it is during, non-COVID-19 times, but it still does exist. What's your message to people who are worried about the appearance of subsidizing oil companies, despite, the hard hit the sector has just taken?
I don't think direct subsidies to oil companies would be the correct model in any event. But for people who think that we shouldn't support one of Canada's key industries at a time when A, we need energy security, and B, we need a functional economy, it's lovely to be idealistic. I understand that climate change is a real and pressing problem. I understand that we need to transition gradually away from a resource economy and from an economy that burns fossil fuels. But you can't transition by pushing somebody off a cliff. We need to have an intelligent, strategic response that puts aside political ideology and looks pragmatically at how we pick up the pieces when the COVID crisis is most acutely over, how we build an economy going forward, and how we help the oil and gas sector to transition towards cleaner alternatives. You don't do that by putting everybody into receivership and leaving behind an environmental cataclysm.
Okay, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much, Senator Simons. Appreciate your time this evening.
My pleasure. Take care.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.